Hello, this is Andrew Al from Digital Charlotte, and welcome to the Digital Inclusion Exchange podcast. Today we'll be listening to the National Digital Inclusion Alliance's, also known as the NDIA's, Net Inclusion webinar series. The National Digital Inclusion Alliance Net Inclusion Conference has been a staple in the digital inclusion community for years, bringing hundreds of practitioners, advocates, academics, internet service providers, and policymakers together to share their knowledge. With social distancing in place, the NDIA is hosting the Net Inclusion 2020 webinar series to replace the conference. This series includes 8 one-hour webinars recorded live from September 16th through November 4th. You can find the full schedule, recordings, and resources at digitalinclusion.org/netinclusion2020 webinar series. The link to this will be in the description. Today's webinar topic is how did the pandemic change digital inclusion work on the ground and in policy. First recorded on November 4th, 2020. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final Net Inclusion webinar of 2020. We're super excited to be able to host this last one with you. And we know it's been a rough day because of the ongoing election. So we'll try to be as cheery and upbeat as we possibly can. Even if somebody has to fake it, they'll do it because they all love you. So we're just going to give it another minute for folks to join, and then we'll get started.
I hear my dog jumping against the door because he hates a closed door and he knows I'm in here, but I'm not going to let him in.
That was Adrianne.
Oh, sorry about that.
We are live. It's okay. We all love the dogs, and we think that's highly entertaining. So welcome again, everyone. I'm Angela Siefer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. This is our final webinar of our Net Inclusion series. We usually hold Net Inclusion in person. We were supposed to be in Portland. Someday we will again see each other's faces and get to all have beverages together. This is the final of a series of 8. If you missed any of the first 7, they are all recorded and on our website at digitalinclusion.org. And we are going to give it just a couple more seconds, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. We are now going to get this party rolling. I'm Angela Siefer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. This is the final in our webinar of 8 for our Net Inclusion series. We're excited to announce our winners of our Digital Equity Champion Award, which we named after Charles Benton, and his daughter, Adrianne, is here to tell us why these awards are important and just spend a few moments with us, and she will announce the awardees, and then we'll keep our program flowing. So, Adrianne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Angela, and good morning and good afternoon to many of you, since I know this is a national audience. Before I begin, I want to thank the committee who so diligently reviewed all of the applications and came up with what I think of are 2 wonderful nominees. Obviously, everybody knows 2020 has laid bare so many inequities. For those of us dedicated to closing the digital divide, we already realize the importance of universal access to affordable high-performance broadband and the skills needed to make best use of it. We know how important it is to our economic health and access to jobs. We know its crucial role in education and lifelong learning. We know how important it is to personal and community health and well-being. We know broadband access can mean more convenient, more efficient use of government services. 2020 has been very dark, and in the throes of a pandemic, we know so much has been lost and is still being lost. We all wish that, after all these years of fighting for digital equity, everyone could have been able to use broadband for work, for learning, for healthcare, and at a time it would have meant more lives saved. But let us not forget the work that has been done this year that did save lives. For just a few moments, let us celebrate the achievements of digital equity advocates, because 2020 has only proven how essential our work is. Today, we honor two digital equity champions, Daniel Noyes, the co-chief executive officer at Tech Goes Home, and Rebecca Kauma, the Economic and Digital Inclusion Program Manager for the City of Long Beach, California. Digital equity, as you all know, is a three-legged stool relying on skills, hardware, and internet access. Under Dan Noyes' leadership, the Tech Goes Home model tackles digital exclusion by providing 15 hours of digital skills training, a new computer to course graduates for $50, and help finding and securing low-cost, high-quality internet service. To date, Tech Goes Home has served more than 35,000 people and distributed over 22,500 new computers. Tech Goes Home uses a train-the-trainer program model, which allows it to serve over 5,500 participants each year with only 7 full-time employees. Dan is vocal on the local, regional, and national digital equity stages. He's not afraid to speak truth to power when it comes to advocating for digital equity. He takes every opportunity to discuss how internet service providers and their leaders can and should improve their low-cost offerings. Rebecca is currently spearheading the digital inclusion roadmap development process in Long Beach, California. She has intentionally incorporated an equity lens into the governance, planning, development, and implementation of the roadmap. Her inclusion practices include recruiting community members and local cross-sector partners for the committee. In an effort to understand the why, she disaggregated digital divide data and performed a root cause analysis to better prioritize communities and neighborhoods most in need. And she's created and implemented community outreach efforts in multiple languages to educate the Long Beach community about digital inclusion services and resources currently available in the city. Rebecca's collaborative approach centers around collective impact. I hope you will all join me in recognizing and thanking the 2020 Charles Benton Digital Equity Champion, Daniel Noyes of Tech Goes Home, and the 2020 Charles Benton Digital Equity Emerging Leader, Rebecca Kauma from the City of Long Beach. Congratulations to both of you, and I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Dan at this point to say something.
Well, thank you, Adrianne, and I liked when you said that I like to speak truth to power. I think what you mean is I like to piss people off, which I'm fully in support of. Don't have much of a filter. When Angela first told me this, that I was getting this award, it was actually in March, and it was what we call pre-COVID. It's like everything is either pre-COVID or post-COVID, right? So it's pre-COVID. It happened to be in Philadelphia, and I realized afterwards that I went through the 5 stages of grief, which are kind of the 5 stages of award acceptance, where at first I completely denied that this was happening. I think I said no to her about 12 times. And then I kind of pissed off. I was like, Angela, this is dumb. You can't give me this award. And then I kind of like bargained, and I was like, come on, Angela, there's definitely other people out there. And then I was a little depressed if I was like, oh man, should I do this? And finally I accepted it, which is, I think, what you want to have happen. Thank you to the entire team at NDIA and the Benton Foundations. Congratulations to Rebecca for being my co-awardee. If ever there was an award that should not be an individual award, but should instead be a group award, it's this one. So I need to give a massive shout out to my entire Tech Goes Home family, both past and present, and especially to my work wife and partner in crime, Theodora Hannah, who is with me all of the way. Like Angela said, and like Adrianne said as well, the last few weeks and months have been really hard for far too many reasons. And even if the current election ends in a final result that we all hope for or we all want, it's still incredibly clear that we have far too many wounds to heal. But isn't that what we all do? Everyone on this Zoom and part of NDIA and beyond that, we open doors of opportunity for those that have had those doors shut in their face for far too long. We find people jobs. We help kids get better grades. We help seniors connect to loved ones. We help those suffering from homelessness find housing. Every one of you that's on this call and part of that group empowers people's lives. And I just want to say I couldn't be more proud to be part of such an incredible group of amazing people. So thank you very much. And I'm, again, honored for this award. Thank you.
And now, Rebecca, would love to hear from you as well, and congratulations again.
Thank you so much, Adrianne, and also congratulations to you, Dan, for that recognition. I want to take the time to thank the National Digital Inclusion Alliance for this honor and recognition. I'm just very humbled to receive the award. And also special thanks to all of our Long Beach digital inclusion partners for their hard work, dedication, and efforts in supporting the city's digital inclusion initiative. I am extremely grateful for their partnership and collaboration in advancing digital equity and inclusion, especially during the pandemic. All of your guys' efforts have truly been amazing, so thank you guys so much. And also, I'm just extremely proud of all of the efforts around racial equity and digital equity that the City of Long Beach has done thus far. For me, it is my true passion and life mission to ensure that low-income communities and also Black communities and communities of color have equitable access to digital inclusion resources and services. So we will continue to advance that mission and ensuring that we continue to provide those resources and services, especially during this crucial time. So thank you guys so much. And again, I'm extremely honored, and keep up all the great work that everyone's doing.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Dan. It's been my pleasure honoring the two of you and your work. And Angela, I just so treasure the partnership between the Benton Institute and NDIA over these many years, and think you're running a fabulous organization at an incredibly critical time for this nation. So again, thanks to you, and thanks to the committee again. And I'm going to turn it over to you and I think your other guest, Yosef.
Fabulous.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrianne.
You're welcome.
Dan and Rebecca and Adrianne, all three of them are very active within the NDIA community. So we are thrilled to have been able to have Adrianne be part of this whole process and have Dan and Rebecca accept these awards from the NDIA community. Okay, we're going to move on to the next part of our program. I'm super excited to announce to you that we have Yosef Getachew from the Common Cause. He's their Media and Democracy Program Director. Yosef is very much a thought leader in the broadband access space. I very much enjoy spending time with Yosef, so I thought everybody else would too, of course. We have already determined that we are going to try our best to keep this very upbeat and exciting for you all so that you won't keep refreshing your election news. So, Yosef, do you want to say a couple words in intro?
Sure. Thanks, Angela, for inviting me on this webinar, and kudos to you and NDIA for really doing a great job with this webinar series. For those who don't know me, my name is Yosef Getachew. I'm the Media and Democracy Program Director at Common Cause. It's a 50-year-old nonprofit organization focused on holding power accountable and infusing our values of democracy within our policymaking. Our Media and Democracy Program really tries to work at the intersection of democracy and technology to make sure that everyone has access to affordable communication services, that there are independent and diverse media outlets to promote free ideas, and that there's a free flow of exchange of information through all communications platforms. We are in an election right now. The votes are being counted, and not to be a downer, because we're going to be as upbeat as possible. But I think this webinar is really timely because of the moment we're in, and digital equity and broadband access play a huge role in our democracy, and it can, elections matter for a reason, and it determines who has access and who doesn't, who can participate in our democracy. So, there are a lot of different reasons why broadband plays a role. Voting is a big one. Many states have online voter registration tools. I actually requested my ballot to come in the mail, but I did it online, which is a new form that most states are adopting now. So it's just one of the ways where your vote counts, but you have to have internet access to register in many cases. Access to government services is a huge thing. I know we'll talk about it later on in this discussion, but the pandemic's really shifted who has access to government services based on an internet connection. If you're applying for unemployment benefits or other benefits that are online only or that are prioritized online, you're out of luck, and you're not going to be able to access those benefits. The census just ended abruptly a few weeks ago, but that moved online only for the first time. So, broadband really determines who counts and who doesn't count in our democracy, and who has a voice and who doesn't have a voice. And that's why I think this webinar and NDIA's work is really important to actually facilitate a more participatory 21st century democracy through digital equity. So that's my spiel, but I am excited to talk to you about all of the different things about digital equity and what the future holds for the landscape. So, just to kick things off to you, Angela, COVID's changed everything, as we know, and we're all at home now more than ever, and we're all relying on our internet connection to do everything. But we know the pandemic's really exposed who has access and who doesn't have access. It's disproportionately impact low-income Americans, people of color, other marginalized communities. So from your perspective, what's NDIA been seeing when it comes to digital equity strategies? How are communities and groups coping with the pandemic?
Thanks, Yosef. We're seeing organizations that already had digital inclusion programs revise those programs so that the programs can be conducted virtually or over the phone or 6 feet apart with masks. But what we're also seeing is organizations who haven't done digital inclusion work in the past now figuring out how to do it because they can't meet their original mission without also helping people get connected to the internet, have the right device, know how to use it, and have the digital skills or the tech support to learn those digital skills. So I'm finding it fascinating in so many ways that the pandemic has caused this awareness. So more funding, more partners, just everything's more, including organizations who hadn't previously done the work. And so those of us who have done the work, I feel like it's our responsibility to make sure that we are providing guidance to those who are now like, so what's the deal with the internet? Like, how do we get it? Why is it so expensive? How can I do any advocacy around changing that? We're getting those kinds of questions. And so we're figuring out how to respond to that.
Yeah, it's interesting how we've all become more aware of the need for digital equity during the pandemic just to access basic things. And I always try and frame this through the lens of my parents, just because my parents are both immigrants. They're older in age, and English is not their first language, although they do speak English, but it just presents a lot of challenges for connectivity, digital literacy, affordability, and things like that. And just one example I can give, my dad, who's in his 70s, he went to the insurance company recently, or the pharmacy recently, to get his prescription refilled. And they told him, well, your doctor wants to schedule an appointment because it's been so long, but they want to do it through telemedicine. And this is what he tells me, it's telemedicine. And so he asked me, what is telemedicine? What does that mean? That's all they told me was telemedicine. And I told him, well, is there an app or a website they gave you to access it? He says, I don't know. How do I access that? And so it just presents a lot of challenges from just an equity landscape of helping people understand how to access these technologies for basic needs. My mom, who's a hairstylist, she's had to just switch over her entire clientele base online. So figuring out, how do I contact people on LinkedIn that I've done their hair in the past, or how do I build a list of former clients that I can quickly contact? It all requires digital skills because of the pandemic. No one's going in anymore to just schedule an appointment. And those are some of the challenges that I'm trying to figure out. How do we address those moving forward? And if we're not going to be in a situation where we're going to be seeing each other anytime soon, because I think we'll be in this pandemic for quite a while, we're going to have to figure out how to, through social distancing, meet some of these challenges. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that. But just how do we make sure that we can train people adequately while being socially distanced and giving them the tools they need?
One of the models that NDIA is helping develop is a digital navigator model, and Miles will put that in the chat for us. This is a model that's developed organically amongst NDIA affiliates and others who realize that in order to continue to provide digital inclusion services, or to start to provide digital inclusion services, they need somebody who can help lead a community member through signing up for internet, if that's the challenge they had, getting a device, if that's the challenge they have, and helping them get to the digital literacy training, if that's the challenge they have. Sometimes it's a really quick tech support kind of issue, like, I just don't know how to use Zoom, and I just need somebody to teach me how to use Zoom. And other times it is, I need to sign up for unemployment benefits, but in order to sign up for unemployment benefits, I'm told I need an email address. So then you have to back up a couple steps to get folks there. That idea of helping folks remotely or virtually, when we all get the irony of that, right? What, you want somebody who's not connected to use a virtual? Well, then it's a matter of getting them to that point so they can be able to participate in those classes online. So the page that Miles has shared in the chat gives a basic overview of what that looks like. We are developing this model with some clients, but also with an understanding from folks in our community. We have a working group and they teach us, and we try to post publicly as much as we can. And we encourage others to use the model. Like, we don't want to own it. We want it to just be out there so it can be replicated. And we've been told that folks are doing that. So that's awesome. What we're also seeing out there, I think that's really important at this time, is, so there are those programs where they're figuring out an exact solution. They're figuring out low-cost connectivity, or the devices, or digital literacy. But then there's also another effort that is designed to recognize existing resources in a community and maybe create some of those new programs that didn't already exist. That's a phenomenon that has definitely exploded. A previous webinar in this series was about coalitions, and in that one, it was really clear some of those coalitions are older, some are newer, some have really taken off during COVID, and that we're seeing even more of those develop in this moment. But some are more of a task force. So short term, who are all the right partners to put in a room? And that's different than a long-term coalition kind of idea. The way NDIA started to think about it with some of our partners is think about it as a digital inclusion ecosystem. Does that community have all the pieces that they need? Do they have folks teaching digital literacy to all the populations that need it, in all the languages, with all the cultural understandings that one would need for those different populations? Is there a source for low-cost devices? Is there discounted internet? Is there free internet in the home? That's something like, can I just do like a quick tangent? It has got to be in the home. We've got to stop saying it's okay that folks have to go to the library. It's okay they have to go to the community center. We also have to say that loaning out hotspots is a Band-Aid, right? That is not a long-term solution. So I think COVID has made that really clear that we have to get at these longer-term solutions.
Yeah, when you bring up the digital inclusion ecosystem, one of the things that stands out to me, and you all have a lot more knowledge about this, is that some digital inclusion groups focus on one or two aspects of digital inclusion. So we're going to address affordability, we're going to address connectivity, but we may not have the resources to address training or literacy or connected devices, or there might be a group that focuses on those, but not the first few elements. So, what do you think stands out from digital inclusion programs that are really trying to take a holistic approach? Like, what are they doing that other programs may want to incorporate?
I think what we're seeing right now is those organizations that really address all of the aspects of digital inclusion, that they are the ones that are most quickly pivoted because they had to. And we don't want to draw attention to the ones that were like, we don't know what to do. But that was the challenge for some folks. But the ones who this is all they do, they figured it out. And I think the other thing is that became more clear during COVID is that idea that it doesn't have to be one organization that does all the things, but we do need to know, we need to do the asset mapping. Who does these things in our community? And then knowing that helps us, okay, well, I don't do refurbishing, but you do refurbishing. So can we strike a deal here? So I think the awareness that we need to have all the different pieces. The digital literacy piece is still the piece that fewer folks understand the necessity of. There was more attention on the connectivity and the devices, and still is, I think, right now. But there's an increased awareness that you have to make sure you're also addressing digital equity. And there's some great research out there, including a report from John Horrigan, who I believe is on this call and could maybe put that in the chat to share with everyone. Showing that it is not just about having a low cost offer, that you have to make sure that there's also the device and the digital literacy.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I take this as coalition work too. You and I work in coalition, and a lot of times we divide up the work. Who's going to write the comment? Who's going to reach out to the Hill, or who's going to do the grassroots work? So it's kind of a good correlation to figure out how do we all work together to achieve or overcome some of these challenges. But moving on to the broadband ecosystem, which is tangential to the digital inclusion ecosystem. We've been talking about the digital divide for 20 years now, and I feel like every time we talk about it, it gets wider as opposed to getting narrower. Part of the challenge is because there are layers to this, and there are always challenges and barriers around getting equitable connectivity to everyone. But that being said, the fact that we're not achieving a more equitable broadband ecosystem today kind of speaks to who's in control, and who are the powers that be that are actually making these decisions. So let's get into that a little bit. What does the ecosystem look like, and how do you think it's impacting all of our work to achieve digital equity?
When we started NDIA about 6 years ago, I had no policy experience, certainly didn't understand the broadband industry. And I say all that to all of you to say, it's okay if it doesn't make sense right now, because you'll figure it out. I figured it out. And here's the reality that I've come to understand is that in the United States, the broadband services that are offered are very much a commodity. They're very lightly regulated. And the light regulation is spotty, in part because we don't have regulations that are for all the internet service providers. There's some that are for the cable, and there's some that are for telecom. And there's also this lack of awareness amongst the general public of even the differences between the technologies. Wireline versus wireless, right? So even wireless, when people use that term, you're like, well, do you mean cellular or do you mean Wi-Fi? Well, it could be either. Oh, well, that's confusing. So the more I think regular folks, and particular digital inclusion advocates, can understand what that broadband ecosystem is, that's how we make change. Because I would really say until very recently, the only experts on broadband were the internet service providers and a handful of other folks. Well, that's not enough, frankly, for us all to understand how does broadband work? Who's in charge of making sure it gets everywhere? And what's really clear is that there's no price controls. They can charge whatever they want to charge. Well, that's good for the market. Is that good for communities? Whew. So like, there's lots of talk right now, like, is the internet a utility? I think the internet is essential. It's an essential service. It's like a utility. We've got to find some middle ground. I'm not suggesting we totally regulate broadband, but I am suggesting there's got to be some ways that we make sure everybody has access, and that it is affordable in a market rate kind of way, and affordable in a subsidized for a low income kind of way, right? There's two kinds of affordability that we need to make sure we throw into the conversation. And then we have to make sure also that we're talking about broadband adoption that has to do with that affordability, and it has to do with the digital literacy skills. So this is what we were just discussing about what the activities are to get to the digital equity. Folks tend to want to focus on the device and the connectivity, but we're not going to increase our broadband adoption rates unless we're also addressing digital literacy.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And the way I kind of look at this is that picking up on what you said about the experts, the broadband providers were the experts for quite a while, and they still claim to be the experts, the only experts, because we deploy the infrastructure and we know how the technology works, and we know what we're doing. Yeah, they do deploy the infrastructure, but it gets me thinking about kind of who watches the watchmen, right? Because the ISPs say that we are the experts, we know how the technology works, and so we know how to best deploy it. And then they'll tell all the regulators, well, we don't need to be overseen by you all because there are other regulators at the state level. So the federal level won't do much. And then they'll tell the state folks, well, don't regulate us because we have federal oversight and it doesn't make sense to have both. And you're just creating more barriers for us to get you all the internet access. So then it creates a situation of, all right, there's no oversight at the federal level. There's no oversight at the state level. And then, like you said, there are no actual levers to make sure it's affordable, that they actually deploy everywhere, that there are some quality of service mechanisms in place to make sure everyone has high-speed broadband that's not suffering from outages. So it creates a situation of how do we regulate them in a way where we get the values that we want in a way where there is some oversight. And the challenge is that I'm an FCC junkie at times, so I'll always point to the FCC as you all create this situation. And without getting into net neutrality and who's going to regulate what, I think there is a situation where when we were deciding, is broadband a telecom service? Is it a utility? The FCC back in, I want to say 2002, when they were looking at cable, because cable was the new player in town, and they were trying to pose a competitive, make competition for a telecom. There were groups saying, well, there needs to be some regulation. And the FCC said, well, cable's this new thing. We don't really know how it's going to work. And so we're going to just call it an information service and do a light touch approach. And then what ended up happening after that is you had the telephone system that the telecoms were operating that had all these regulations from back in the 30s, 40s, 50s about quality of service, privacy. We're not going to get into privacy, but that was a big thing, about affordability, price controls that didn't apply to cable or broadband, the IP-focused systems. And so it created this dual lanes of we're going to keep regulating telecom one way and then broadband another way, although broadband was becoming more and more common as the primary means of communication that we're all using Zoom now. So that's basically showing you where we got to. But the problem is that when we create these dual situations, it also created a situation where the broadband providers were saying, well, we're not like telecom, so don't regulate us that way. But then more and more people were using broadband as opposed to telecom. So then states were saying, all right, let's also deregulate telecom because telecom was saying, well, we have to compete with broadband. And so you had protections like carrier of last resort, where if you're a telecom provider, you have to provide service to people who have no other choice of getting it. that's getting diminished. You have these quality of service mechanisms in place that are getting diminished. We can get into this later, but the whole AT&T DSL situation where they're discontinuing DSL in parts of California, and there's no alternative there, just speaks to the lack of regulation in broadband, but both in telecom as well. And so there's the dual deregulation framework has kind of created this mechanism of we're going to deregulate everything and no one's watching us. And it carries over too. So it's not just the old telephone network. It's not just new broadband technologies. It's also emerging tech. I mean, 5G is something that I keep hearing all the time from ISPs. I'm watching SNL and there's nothing but 5G commercials. I'm on YouTube, nothing but 5G commercials.
So we have to make sure that we continue to address the potential new digital divides. So I think what you're getting at, Yosef, is so your example of DSL, and Miles or Sean's going to stick that in the chat, NDIA's paper with Communication Workers of America about AT&T. They're just like, we're just not going to take care of our old DSL anymore. And we're going to need folks to switch to fiber if they have it, or they can switch to wireless. Oh, there's data caps on wireless. Oh, yeah, sorry we didn't put fiber in your neighborhood. Like, that's just kind of the answer. And now we have 5G coming along where it's being built. And we know, like, I would stake everything on the fact that 5G is not going to be deployed equitably. Why would it be deployed equitably? Their goal is return on investment. That is not a judgment. That's just a statement of fact. Their goal is quick return on investment. Where are they going to get that? Higher income areas, more dense, higher income areas. So if we know that that's the goal, and we know that that's their activities are going to be, that's what's going to be their choices, then the public interest community and the public in general, we all have to decide, well, then we're going to need to make some other choices ourselves to make sure that everyone does have access to the newest technologies. And it's not going to be immediate, of course. But if it comes to a point where they're just like now, the faster your technology, if you have 3 kids at home and everybody's on Zoom and grandma's on Facebook and mom has to VPN into work, and look, we just need more than we needed before. And that's not even when we all need to stay safe and watch some Netflix, which is totally okay for people to watch Netflix on a subscription that's being subsidized by someone else, because we've got to stay in our homes, people. So I think us all like looking ahead and making sure that we are figuring out those next new divides and drawing attention to them before they become divides. That's something we can do now, but it wasn't a thing before because there weren't enough people that understood it.
Yeah, and it's the same tactic that the ISPs are using. We're the experts in 5G. We know how to deploy 5G, just like we're the experts in telecom and wireline cable broadband. And so we don't need any oversight. So they're telling states, if you want this shiny new thing for your communities, just let us steamroll you. Well, they're using words like let us deploy and let us basically access your rights of way to deploy these networks. And the states are saying, oh, wow, this 5G thing is coming. So we need to do what we can to get it. And I don't think they're realizing their power and their authorities to actually make sure this gets deployed equitably. I'd love to see states look at things like service area requirements, and making sure that all areas get served, not just the affluent areas, or affordable options of making sure that if you're going to deploy in these areas, you have to provide some sort of affordable option for low-income areas, or just not pass them over, or some sort of quality of service standards. If states own the rights of way and they own the poles and other infrastructure elements to actually get this thing deployed, then they should be able to use their power. And we've seen some examples of San Jose and other cities doing agreements in this and creating these digital equity funds for 5G. And that's definitely one approach. And there are others too, in terms of making sure that there are levers that states exercise and advocates exercise to make sure that these new divides don't exist, and understanding that no, AT&T, you're not the only expert in that round, and there are others too to talk about this.
And I think that's part of what we're seeing in this moment with COVID is the self-educating on the issue. I know NDIA's experienced, that we have more affiliates. We've hit 500. We're very excited. The community has grown, just that there are more folks wanting to figure it out. And one of the things we're seeing, a trend, I'm going to call it, that we're watching and figuring out how we can support, is community efforts they're building networks to address affordability. And in the past, we would see folks build networks to address availability. This is a way different scenario. So the infrastructure, usually in an urban area, already exists, but the community is getting together to build a network, usually neighborhood specific, not community-wide. Neighborhood specific that will be either subsidized or building it in a way such that it is low cost, in order for those particular residents to have access to a low cost offer. I am fascinated by this because this is a new phenomena in our field, and it's definitely organically happening from the ground. And so we are figuring out how we can support that effort.
Yeah, so getting into community broadband, to me it's super interesting. And full disclosure, one of my first jobs at the FCC was on the municipal broadband item, where they were trying to preempt state laws that were blocking community broadband, and that was really how I got into this space. And I thought, wow, this is a community coming together to really build a network where an ISP isn't investing in, or they're under investing in, and their community members are the ones who are paying the price. So I think it's a very interesting way to get around the affordability problem, or to address the affordability problem, to address the competition problem, to address the equity problem. There's actually a map at muninetworks.org where they actually chart out all the different municipal projects, from projects focused on getting community-owned fiber to the home out, or community-owned cable networks out, or just open access networks, which is this whole other ballgame of the community just builds the network, and then all the ISPs that want can operate on the network and provide service. So it creates a situation of one for all, or come all to provide service. And then you can address the affordability problem. You can address the competition problem, the quality of service problem, because there are more players competing. I don't know if it necessarily addresses the digital literacy problem, because that might be more focused on the digital inclusion folks, but you definitely.
So can I say traditionally it hasn't?
Yeah.
And we've had this conversation where NDIA appreciates the efforts of community-owned networks, but for the most part, they weren't any more affordable. And they didn't have, most of them didn't have subsidized offers. That is changing right now. We started to shift pre-COVID. Now it's definitely shifted. There are now community-owned networks that are subsidizing. Chattanooga is a great example where they have, because they couldn't quite figure out how to do it before, like it's tricky. And now COVID hit, and they had more folks who wanted to financially invest in that solution. And so then they were able to figure out legally how to do it. The other examples that we see that I think are fascinating to watch is like Wilson, North Carolina, the green light service there. They allow folks to turn on and off their service without fees. So money's tight this month, turn off your broadband. When you can turn it back on, you turn it back on. There's no fee assessed to that. That's amazing. Why can't we do that everywhere? Right? But that idea came about in a community-owned network because they were seeing and feeling that need from their customers. And that's not that it just, for whatever reason, we all know the different reasons, it hasn't developed in our more commercial services.
No, that's interesting, because one of the challenges at the federal level, when they're looking at who has access and who doesn't, a lot of times they may count someone, well, there are a lot of issues with figuring out access, but even subscription-based, they'll count someone who subscribed for a particular month, but may not be subscribed the next month. There's this month-to-month challenge, particularly for low-income folks, where they're all costs cost focused and price conscious. And so if you're only subscribed for 1 month and not the next month, it creates this challenge of, are you really adopted? And what are the mechanisms to actually get you consistent adoption? So I think the community broadband focused proposal where we'll stop the service if you can't afford it, but won't cut you off, might be one solution. And it might help other solutions of addressing affordability and giving folks actual affordable options too.
I think that brings us to the conversation that you and I have had a couple of times, Yosef, about what are the different federal answers that are out there. The potential for community-owned networks is one of those, but also, and you and I struggled over, like, how do we put this into buckets that folks can more easily grasp? Because there are so many, like the list is actually, like I did it, it goes it's actually a pretty long list of all the specific things, like mapping, right? Specific ways that we can do a better job getting at broadband access in the United States, making sure it's affordable and ubiquitous and the right speed, low latency, like the latency, get it out, all the different pieces. And so let's share our buckets with folks. Yosef and I aren't tied to these buckets. If somebody has a better idea, they should just speak up. But these are the buckets Yosef and I came up with. So the one is the increasing broadband adoption through support. So what's the support needed to increase broadband adoption? And so a big one in there is, as we mentioned, digital literacy. Connected to that digital literacy is state equity planning. Because if we don't have states figuring out digital equity plans, they don't know what's going on. That gets back to the whole asset mapping business. And I really, really think if we had managed to get through the Digital Equity Act pre-COVID, states would have been so much more prepared for what happened than they were. Okay, we weren't. I'll let that go. And we can move into the fact that we still need state digital equity plans. So state digital equity plans, and then money for that digital inclusion work. Because remember, everyone, digital equity is the goal, digital inclusion is the how. And then, so when Yosef and I created that bucket, then the next big piece under it is the affordability. And then we have a whole list of things where we want to get at affordability. Yosef, do you want to?
Yeah. So with affordability, it's interesting because it also cuts into it's similar to the dual lane, like you described with digital equity. One is just addressing the actual price problem of, can we make these products, these services more affordable for people who just they're too expensive for. And so one of these solutions is just, all right, we need a subsidy. We need some sort of money amount where we could subsidize the cost of internet access for low-income people. And there's a whole criteria around who qualifies for low-income subsidies. And we have a Lifeline program at the federal level right now, which I'm sure a lot of folks on this chat know about. But there is the eligibility criteria for Lifeline when it comes to what threshold below the poverty level are you, when it comes to are you part of Medicaid and other government assistance programs, SNAP, and things like that. But that's just a small pool of low-income folks. There are so many other communities out there that may not necessarily meet that criteria. And there are states and other entities that have actually expanded the poverty threshold. So it's not just the 135% threshold of Lifeline, but it goes beyond that. It's the 200% threshold or more, because there are just so many people that are technically low income. And there are other categories of Title I schools that predominantly serve low-income students. And there are students who get qualified for the school lunch program. How do we make sure all of those communities get connected? And so that goes into the subsidy, and that goes into who's qualified for the subsidy. And that's really just addressing the pure affordability problem, because it's too expensive for that community. But then there's the other problem of what are all the challenges with broadband access and deployment that make it unaffordable right now. And so there's policies and solutions around of saying if the federal government provides funding for broadband, those providers who get federal funding need to offer an affordable option. And so, if you're benefiting from a government program, you shouldn't just purely benefit without giving something back. And a lot of times in the past, we've had government programs where we've been quick to give out money, and the money is only going to certain pockets of the community, or it's only going to more affluent areas, and it's not addressing the challenges we have with equity. And so how do we get to that through a policy solution that says, okay, you get federal funding, then you have to do an affordable option. And then there's the whole transparency problem too. And, I had Verizon for my subscription, and I only had a choice between Verizon and Comcast, but I didn't have that many options and that much information about what am I getting? What's the bang for my buck here, really? Because it's not necessarily transparent when it comes to offerings, when it comes to price information, when it comes to quality of service. These are all things that the government and other state policymakers need to require broadband providers to disclose. There's a great report by OTI, New America Open Technology Institute, that put out the cost of connectivity report. And it really got into looking at how are these companies pricing their services, because no one knows. No one knows how there's just a lack of transparency. And they actually call for something called a broadband nutrition label, where you actually put information with the service in terms of how much it costs, including things like below the line fees, the cost of a service after the promotion, all these other hidden fees that could be associated with it, along with quality of service and speed metrics and things like that. So you know what you're getting, and you know what you're paying for. And if you don't like that service, you can get something else. And a lot of times, this actually reveals more information about the quality of a service or what's out there that you, the customer, can actually look into and get. So it's really policies to support affordability. But even with all these buckets, go ahead.
The transparency piece is both what we're asking for is both the nutrition label for consumers to make a decision, but also the aggregate data so that policymakers know what's going on. Nobody knows really what the average cost of broadband services in the United States. Yeah. Why don't we know the answer to that question? And the responses you'll get back are, well, it's complicated because people have bundled services and there's different kinds of broadband and all the services are different, so we can't compare them. Well, then let's figure out how to get at that, right? It doesn't seem like it's that complicated that we can't get to an answer for that question. And we need to not only get at that answer nationally, but we need that answer locally so folks can compare. Basically, folks need to know if they should be mad, right? They need folks at the local level need to be able to say, hey, everybody around here pays $75 a month, but if we lived over there in that county, they're paying $65 a month average. $10 kind of seems like a lot per month, right? And so, but you don't know that that's the situation because we don't have the data to be able to say, okay, we need to press for some lower prices because we don't feel like it's, we're getting best value from where we are.
Yeah. And really transparency feeds into funding. If we know what broadband providers are providing for prices and other quality of service metrics, then policymakers can make those decisions of, okay, Comcast is providing this service for $70 a month. That's too expensive for this community. Or AT&T is providing this service at $35 a month, and it's serving this community. That might be workable, but we don't know. And once we actually figure out those pricing metrics and other standards for a service, then we can actually create that subsidy that serves low-income people and other folks. And it's actually really interesting because we've had all these deployment programs and funding programs in the past, but you all have actually found that those deployment programs aren't necessarily serving the communities that they need to, right? And there's been inequities in how those programs are being deployed. So curious if you could share a bit about that and NDIA's work there.
So we've, we like to say it's one of the first things that made us famous is the digital redlining work. And it came about because we had been working with some of our affiliates in Cleveland who were developing a plan to promote AT&T's discount offer. Because we were all like, yes, AT&T has a discount offer. And essentially, the digital inclusion programs that are out there, which NDIA has a map of those, and my folks will put a link of our NDIA affiliates in the chat. Those affiliates are unpaid marketers for discount programs. Many of them don't receive money from the internet. A handful do, but most don't receive any funding from the internet service providers. So they're marketing these programs just because it's the right thing to do for the people they're serving, because discount is a great idea. So doing that in Cleveland, we were getting really confused. Our policy and research director at the time, Bill Callahan, lived in Cleveland, and he like his own neighborhood. He was seeing this like, why can't we get people signed up for this? And AT&T was saying, no, actually, they're not eligible. Well, yes, they are eligible. They're low income. They meet your criteria. And they would say no, because they don't have the right speed coming into their house. I'm like, what do you mean they don't have the right speed coming into their house? They had set up the program to be at certain speed levels, and the lowest one is 3 meg. So if you had less than 3 meg coming into your house, you were ineligible for the $5 a month service. You had to keep paying full price for your less than 3 meg. So NDIA took the very odd position of saying, dear AT&T, would you let these people have access for $5 because they actually have less than 3 meg coming into their house? We got the help of the FCC to get folks at AT&T to actually talk to us. Their answer, no. Not going to do that. Wow. I mean, I felt kind of dumb asking in the first place, but I thought you'd at least do it. It's not even probably for that many people, right? So this progresses, ends up in the media. CNN Money picks it up. AT&T changes their mind. They are now going to provide that service at $5 for those poor folks who have less than 3 meg coming into their house and aren't eligible. But what that did is cause us to dig into the fact, like, what? Why do they have such slow internet? And then we overlaid it with poverty data. We used AT&T's own data that they had provided to the FCC to see the different neighborhoods. Wow, it's the same neighborhoods that were traditionally redlined for housing.
Yeah.
The same neighborhoods, right? They were getting screwed before, they're getting screwed again. And that's incredibly frustrating. But also, I think it helps us see the realities of it gets us back to that. This is the broadband industry. They are making decisions based upon what is best for their shareholders, not necessarily what's best for their customers, right, or the communities that they serve. Again, that's just the way it is. It doesn't matter if any of us get upset about it. It's just a fact. So then we'll need to make decisions as to what we're going to do in order to address a situation where we're probably not going to get AT&T to change their minds. So then what else can we do? And that's where we get at, okay, well, let's figure out, can we bring in alternative sources of broadband? One of the questions in the chat was, what are other countries doing? Open networks. Build some fiber with government money and let competitors use the fiber. It's still an open market. It's just that the underlying structure has been subsidized by the government.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it gets us to the third bucket, really. And when you want to talk about affordability and digital inclusion programs, sometimes the right hand isn't knowing what the left hand is doing, and this state isn't knowing what that state's doing. So one of the things that is super important is coordination. You all could speak more about that than probably any group, because you work with so many partners on the ground, figuring out what programs are in place for digital inclusion and which ones are not. But what we've seen at the federal level is that no one knows what's going on the ground to the extent that they should. And there isn't coordination of actually saying, okay, this state is creating this program to address affordability, and this community is looking at digital literacy. How can we provide that support? How can we connect them to other groups? So I think a digital equity office or some sort of position in a future administration of creating a czar that actually oversees all these different things and can create policies or help implement policies to address gaps. Because right now, if we're operating in a vacuum where one state is doing a certain thing and no one knows about it, and no one knows if it works, or if someone is doing something that doesn't work and we don't know about it, it creates holes in our policy and it creates digital equity failures. So,
and it's even the gaps amongst federal agencies. And there's been some efforts during the Biden administration and during the Trump administration for federal agencies to talk to each other, but it's not its own office. There's not a way to really be able to keep all of that coordinated. And it doesn't usually involve digital literacy. So they're really only addressing availability, not adoption. So the idea that there be not just a broadband coordination, but digital equity. I think the distinction is really important. And if nothing else, COVID has helped us draw attention to the fact that we cannot just focus on broadband availability. We have to look at adoption. And to do that, a frame one can put on it is digital equity. Everybody having access to affordable broadband at the speeds they need in order to do whatever it is they need to do.
Yeah, and just on that point about federal coordination, if you just Google broadband deployment programs, you'll be surprised that there are hundreds, well, maybe hundreds, but several broadband deployment programs out there that groups can apply to for funding. It's mostly on the deployment side. Very little is on the adoption or literacy side. But from a coordination standpoint, most people don't know about these programs. If you're a school, if you're an HBCU, you may not know that you're eligible for funding to get broadband connectivity to your campus or to the community around your campus. If you are a state or local government, you may not know about a program that's meant to provide you with funding to address connectivity. So even from a point of education and outreach that a digital equity office can work on and can help facilitate, making sure that people know about the existing programs that are out there and people take advantage of them, and not just the groups with a significant amount of resources, but the underserved groups that may not have a lawyer on staff to actually walk them through the funding applications that the government websites have, or coordinate more of the administrative stuff. It should be a simple process that a digital equity coordinator in office or a czar can help facilitate. So that's definitely something that, I think we'd both love to see.
We would love to see that, and we would love to see it at a pretty high enough level that they can get some stuff done. Like, not like basement of NDIA or something, right? Like, really, it should be at the White House is where I think it should be. I don't know if we'll manage to get there, but we should definitely give that a shot. So we are a little after 3, and we told folks they could ask questions. I haven't seen anything in the Q&A, and there might have been some stuff that got mixed into the chat, but we can't. The chat goes so quickly, folks. There's no way we can keep track of that. So if you have a question, stick it in the Q&A, and Yosef and I will be sure to get at that. Sorry I interrupted you, Yosef.
No, I just wanted to talk a bit about how do we get all this stuff done. We're advocates, and this is hard. These aren't things that we can just ask for, and then someone in government can say, okay, yeah, let's do a digital equity office, or let's get a subsidy done. Or let's get some of these transparency metrics implemented. So as advocates, what are some of the strategies that you think we need to be looking at, or some of the strategies that we've tried to implement currently during COVID to really get something, even though we haven't been successful?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a question in the Q&A. We have a couple now. So the first one is, how do we change this industry dynamic? And it references ALA. ALA is involved in digital inclusion advocacy. I can't speak to their involvement in addressing the broadband dynamic. But Yosef, do you want to take, it's a pretty big question, changing the industry dynamic?
Yeah, I think it's a multi-layered question. We talked a lot about how they see themselves as the experts. They position themselves in a place where they're not getting regulated by the federal government or the state governments for the most part. So one is just creating an understanding that these are essential services. These are, and we all know that now. COVID's shown that. So it's looking at our levers of power at the federal, state, and local level to actually implement that as a policy. You are an essential service. You have to provide a certain quality of service at a certain price to make sure everyone has access. I think the other component when you actually break that down is what are the current how are these providers maintaining their power? How are they getting a stranglehold on the ecosystem where no one is telling them what to do, or no one's really controlling how they operate? I think it's figuring out how do we get new interest in the field. And we talked a lot about community-owned broadband, open access networks, cooperatives are another emerging way of getting connectivity out there. There are ideas about communities or nonprofits or other smaller entities entering the fray and saying, we're going to provide service in areas that are just being ignored. So it's getting more of these voices in here that can fill the holes and change the dynamics of power. And that's where grassroots come into.
Yeah, so it is both that on the ground and that policy work. And so this is really the nexus where NDIA sits. And we got started doing that more in the realm of organizations that were providing, helping folks sign up for discount internet, helping folks get access to devices, teaching digital literacy. But in this moment in time, when we're understanding the great necessity of widening our broadband ecosystem in the United States, that same activity on the ground is essential to influencing policy, just as we've already been thinking about it. And I think the difference is the broadband services itself it's not, hugely technical. You can understand the basics in order to figure out, the policies that need changed, as I can attest to, because I cannot tell you exactly all the technicalities of how it works, right? But I understand just enough to cause some trouble and have some interesting conversations and change how things work. So it's both that on the ground, figuring out how to create solutions, and then that education of how does broadband work? What are the policies that are good or bad for the broadband industry or the community, or sometimes it's good or bad for both. And so how can we make those changes? But we're not going to we don't figure out those little intricacies unless we're doing the work, right? Because otherwise, if we're not engaged at that level, we end up where we were before, which is just relying upon the providers to tell us because they do understand it. So I think that's the part where we need to do a better job of more folks working on those solutions at the local ground and hearing from them so as to influence that federal and state policy too.
Yeah, and for the most part, these are regional and national networks. And so that's how they have a lot of ability to influence decisions and control how they operate. And when you realize that all politics is local and all broadband is really local too. And everyone at the local level has a lot more ability to influence how deployment gets operated, as opposed to looking at this from a purely federal or regional level. Yes, the federal government has a huge role to play, but it's really at the local level where we can make a lot of changes and implement equitable solutions.
So we have two more questions in the Q&A. One is, if I want to start with understanding what organizations are already working on digital equity inclusion initiatives in my state, where do I start? I would start with NDIA's affiliates list. And so Miles will stick that in the chat again for folks to make sure you have it handy. That shows you where we know digital inclusion programs are, organizations that have joined NDIA as affiliates. It is not a complete list. There are a lot of digital inclusion programs out there. There are not a lot of digital inclusion organizations, but there are a lot of digital inclusion programs or organizations that have some component that addresses the broadband at home, the connectivity, the devices, and the digital literacy skills. So start with the list that we have, but then you'd have the hard part is you just have to ask around. You have to ask folks, so who's doing this work, and use really specific questions. Because if you say who's doing digital inclusion, you might get no response back because they might not use that term at all. And then we have a second question, Yosef, which is we would like to see something provided more fairly. We see Microsoft and Apple going to a more expensive monthly or annual fee to use their programs. So this gets at the applications piece of it, which NDIA tends to focus on the internet in the home, the device, and the digital literacy skills. But the last piece actually of a digital inclusion definition is applications. And so the question is there that this person gets that this is how they continue bringing in funding, right? This is their business plan, is that keep paying for the subscriptions rather than letting us buy it like we used to do, right? When we would buy Microsoft Office one time and then you keep using it until they don't support it anymore. But Yosef, what are your thoughts on how we address those kinds of applications that are now becoming more expensive and have a recurring cost to them?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because it gets to not just getting access, but getting people onboarded onto the internet where they could actually apply for a job or access healthcare or get a bank account if they're unbanked. So I think there are solutions around low income offerings for these applications, or making them free for a certain amount of time. Or I think there could be a situation where you take applications that more of a on a competitive playing field, looking for the applications that aren't necessarily cost-based, but are much more affordable or free, and using those to access the services you need. So, Microsoft Office is the suite of tools that most people use for word processing. Are there other word processors out there that get to the same functions that you need to meet daily needs? If they're not, how can we create it? If you're looking at applications to communicate, whether it's email or things like that, are there solutions out there that can get you access to those without getting to the barriers of cost?
And this kind of takes me back. So I've been doing this work for about 20 some years, and one of the great gains that we had years ago was when Microsoft made their Office available at a discounted rate for refurbishers. So those who were refurbishing it and getting refurbished machines into the hands of low-income households could have access to a lower, and that's still a program that's around today. So we actually do have a history, an example of how that has worked in the past. It is limited to just those refurbished devices, which is different now, right? Because it's not like the software has to come on the device. And most of us don't, many of us do actually work in the cloud when we have the availability of the internet. So I think the question is valid, and that one that we will be continuing to work on. And it gets also at the issue of the digital divide never ending. I actually said that on a call with my local community, and one woman said it about made her want to cry because she was really on a path, and she feels like we're on a path to addressing it, and because this does feel doable to lots of folks. I have lots of people say that to me. They say, we can close the digital divide. This is doable. And I think the part where we need to be super cautious is that we can close it for a current digital divide.
Yeah.
But there's always going to be another digital divide. The speed is the most obvious one right in front of us. We might be able to solve it for 25.3, but is 25.3 actually what we need anymore? Right? So then there's the next one, the next speed, and then we don't know what technologies are going to come along. There's Internet of Things. That could cause, if you're not sure, if you don't have the the tools that your health provider wants you to use to track your health, those are Internet of Things, right? I'm not talking like smart refrigerators necessarily, but kind of life-saving Internet of Things, and you can't afford to buy them, then that's another digital divide. We know 5G is going to be another digital divide. So I think we have to be really careful with that, how we talk about bridging the digital divide. I don't think there is the digital divide. I know we all use that because it's easy to be able to convey to people. But if you want to dig into the weeds, and I think a lot of the folks on this call are digging into the weeds, we have to get at starting to change our language with funders and policymakers so that they understand you can't just write a one-time check and think that's going to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And with every new technology and with every new product, there's always going to be that group that's marginalized, that's left behind, whether it's students, people of color, low-income communities. And so our policies need to really center these groups when we're looking at making sure technology is accessible and affordable. So, on that note, this is your show, Angela, so I'd love to turn it to you and say, what is that call to action that you think everyone should be fighting for at this moment we're in, where our election is currently undecided, but we're hoping to get results soon?
We are hoping, and when we wrap this up, we'll let you all get back to refreshing your election news sites. I think the call to action is the awareness. We have to have more folks understanding what's going on out there. So I welcome everyone, if you're not already, to join NDIA. It is free. I think the more that we share this kind of information with each other and we share these great ideas, that's how we can get to those big solutions. So huge thank you to Yosef for joining me today. This was a fabulous conversation, definitely one of the more less stressful days for me, because it's so easy to talk to Yosef. Big thank you to Yosef, and thank you to the NDIA team, who's done a smash up job putting all those links in and making sure that these are quality productions. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a fabulous day.
Thank you.